My name is Beatrice Ashford, and should these pages endure beyond my own lifetime, they will bear witness to thoughts that no respectable Victorian lady was ever expected to confess. On a damp October evening in the year 1872, while a persistent rain traced delicate patterns upon the tall windows of our London residence and the muted glow of the fire cast restless shadows across the drawing-room walls, I began this secret account of my existence. Concealed beneath the appearance of ordinary domestic diligence, my mother believed I occupied myself with penmanship, a suitable accomplishment for a young woman of breeding, while my father assumed I was reviewing household figures and correspondence. Neither entertained the possibility that I was documenting the private observations that society demanded remain forever unspoken. In our age, a lady was expected to embody restraint with such perfection that her own desires gradually dissolved beneath layers of etiquette, obligation, and performance. She was to speak softly, move gracefully, smile pleasantly, and suppress any sentiment that might disturb the fragile order upon which respectable society depended. Reputation was treasured above truth, appearance above sincerity, and obedience above individuality. At 19 years of age, I had already become intimately acquainted with these unwritten laws. Our home stood among a row of distinguished brick houses whose polished facades concealed countless private disappointments. Each day unfolded according to rituals so precise they resembled the workings of a finely crafted clock. Servants rose before dawn to light fires and prepare rooms. Breakfast appeared at the appointed hour. Correspondence arrived before noon. Callers occupied the afternoon. Tea punctuated the day with practiced civility, and dinner concluded the evening beneath the watchful gaze of social expectation. To an outside observer, our circumstances might have appeared enviable. My father enjoyed professional success. My mother possessed admirable connections, and our household operated with the efficiency expected of a prosperous family. Yet beneath this polished surface lingered a constant awareness that every conversation, every gesture, and every decision carried consequences capable of shaping an entire future. Nowhere was this more evident than in discussions concerning marriage. My mother's attention rarely strayed from the subject. Suitable gentlemen were assessed with a thoroughness usually reserved for financial investments. Family standing, income, property, and influence received exhaustive consideration, while affection remained an afterthought scarcely worthy of mention. I often found myself wondering whether young men carried similar burdens or whether they moved through the world with freedoms inaccessible to women. Such questions, however, were dangerous companions, and so I entrusted them only to silence. That evening, as the rain continued, its patient rhythm against the glass and the fire settled into a low murmur. I opened a small leather notebook acquired without my family's knowledge, and stared at its untouched pages. For the first time in my life, I sensed the possibility of complete honesty. Dipping my pen into the ink, I recorded a single promise that would shape everything that followed. I intend to tell the truth. The morning following my solemn promise to record nothing but the truth arrived beneath a veil of dense London fog that transformed the familiar street outside our residence into a landscape of shifting shadows and uncertain outlines. From my bedroom window, the neighboring houses appeared less like permanent structures and more like specters emerging reluctantly from the pale gray gloom. Such mornings were common in the city, yet I often felt they revealed something essential about Victorian society itself, for beneath its polished surface lay countless hidden ambitions, disappointments, and secrets obscured from public view. As I descended to breakfast, I carried within me the strange exhilaration of possessing a private world known only to myself. The previous evening's entry rested safely beneath a loose floorboard, concealed beneath my bed. a hiding place, discovered entirely by accident during childhood and preserved ever since as a sanctuary for forbidden treasures. The breakfast table presented its usual scene of carefully ordered domesticity. My father sat behind a newspaper reporting political debates, commercial developments, and events occurring across the expanding British Empire. My mother occupied herself with correspondence and social arrangements while simultaneously observing every detail of my appearance with the vigilance of a military commander inspecting troops before a campaign. It was during this ordinary meal that she informed me of an upcoming gathering to be hosted by acquaintances of considerable standing. Several eligible gentlemen would attend. The announcement was delivered casually, yet the significance behind it was unmistakable. Such gatherings were not merely social occasions. They represented carefully constructed marketplaces of status and opportunity where futures could be determined through conversation, observation, and calculation. I responded with the composure expected of a well-bred young lady while inwardly experiencing a familiar sensation of resistance. Increasingly, I found myself questioning why an intelligent woman should possess so little authority over the direction of her own life. The education provided to girls of my class encouraged accomplishments, but discouraged independence. We were taught music, drawing, French conversation, and proper etiquette, while subjects such as politics, law, finance, and higher scholarship remained largely reserved for men. Society praised feminine refinement, yet feared feminine ambition. Later that afternoon, I accompanied my mother on a series of visits, requiring endless exchanges of pleasantries whose true purpose seemed to involve the subtle measurement of wealth, influence, and reputation. Every drawing room contained its own hierarchy. Every conversation concealed intentions beneath layers of courtesy. Every smile carried calculations invisible to those insufficiently attentive. Returning home near dusk, I felt exhausted by the performance required of respectable society. After dinner, I retired early and retrieved my diary from its hiding place. The fire crackled softly while distant. Church bells drifted through the darkness beyond my window. Opening the notebook, I found myself writing with greater confidence than before. The world expected me to become the heroine of a story written by others. Yet for the first time I began to suspect that another possibility existed. Perhaps these pages would become more than a record. Perhaps they would become evidence that beneath the corsets, customs, and conventions of Victorian England lived women whose thoughts extended far beyond the narrow boundaries society assigned to them. The days preceding the gathering passed with an almost unbearable slowness, as though time itself had become entangled within the endless rituals that governed respectable Victorian life. Every hour seemed occupied by some obligation deemed essential by society, yet strangely hollow to those required to perform it. My mother devoted herself to preparations with an enthusiasm that suggested the forthcoming evening possessed far greater significance than any event I had previously attended. New gloves were ordered, a dress was altered, invitations were discussed, and every detail of my appearance became the subject of careful consideration. The more attention bestowed upon these arrangements, the more I felt myself transformed from a human being into an object intended for display. Such thoughts were dangerous, yet they returned with increasing frequency. On the afternoon of the gathering, a cold rain swept across London, rattling windows and darkening the sky long before sunset. Servants moved briskly through the house carrying coal, polishing silver, and preparing for our departure. By evening, our carriage joined a procession of others navigating streets, illuminated by gas lamps whose pale glow shimmered upon wet cobblestones. The city appeared magnificent from a distance. Yet I often suspected that beneath its grandeur lay countless stories of loneliness, hidden behind elegant facades. Upon arriving at the residence of our hosts, I was immediately enveloped by a world of chandeliers, polished marble, and carefully rehearsed civility. Gentlemen in dark coats and ladies, adorned in silk and lace, filled the rooms with a constant murmur of conversation. Every smile appeared effortless. Every greeting seemed sincere. Yet beneath the surface flowed an invisible current of judgment and ambition. People observed one another with remarkable precision while pretending not to observe at all. It was a skill Victorian society had perfected. Throughout the evening, I was introduced to several young men whose qualifications had clearly been discussed long before our arrival. Some possessed wealth, others influence, and a few displayed enough confidence to speak almost exclusively about themselves. I responded politely, fulfilling my expected role, while secretly recording impressions within my memory for later examination. Then something unexpected occurred. While standing near a library doorway seeking temporary refuge from the noise, I noticed a young gentleman examining the bookshelves rather than the guests. Such behavior immediately distinguished him from nearly everyone else present. His attention appeared genuinely occupied by the volumes before him, rather than the social theater unfolding around us. A few moments later, our paths crossed through an introduction, arranged by circumstance rather than design. His name was Mr. Nathaniel Pembroke. Unlike the others, he asked questions and listened carefully to the answers. He spoke of literature, travel, and scientific discoveries, rather than family fortunes and social connections. For the first time that evening, I found conversation requiring no performance. Yet, even as we spoke, I remained conscious of the countless expectations surrounding us. Victorian society permitted interaction, but monitored it closely. Every word carried implications. Every glance invited interpretation. Before the evening concluded, our conversation was interrupted by obligations elsewhere in the room. We exchanged only the briefest farewell. Nothing extraordinary had occurred. No declaration had been made. No promise had been offered. Yet, as our carriage carried us home through the rain-soaked streets of London, I found my thoughts returning unexpectedly to the young man who had chosen books over society and curiosity over convention. That night, seated beside my bedroom fire with my diary open before me, I wrote his name for the first time and wondered whether fate occasionally entered a room so quietly that most people never noticed its arrival. In the days following the gathering, I became increasingly irritated by the persistence with which my thoughts returned to Mr. Nathaniel Pembroke. Such behavior struck me as both impractical and slightly absurd, for our acquaintance consisted of little more than a single conversation conducted beneath the watchful eyes of society. Yet, despite every effort to dismiss the matter, fragments of our exchange continued to occupy my mind during the most ordinary moments of the day. While practicing the piano, arranging flowers, or enduring lengthy visits from distant relatives, I would suddenly recall a remark he had made regarding a recent scientific expedition or a passage from a novel he admired. What disturbed me most was not the memory itself but the realization that I had rarely encountered a gentleman who regarded a young woman's thoughts as worthy of genuine attention. The novelty of such treatment revealed an uncomfortable truth about the world I inhabited. Several days later, my mother received a note bearing the seal of the family who had hosted the gathering. Although she attempted to conceal her satisfaction while reading its contents, her expression betrayed her immediately. Before the evening concluded, I learned that Mr. Pembroke's family had expressed interest in making our acquaintance further through a series of entirely respectable social visits. The announcement was delivered with calculated casualness, yet I recognized it as the opening movement in a familiar Victorian process whose ultimate objective was never openly discussed yet always understood: I accepted the news with outward composure while privately experiencing a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. The following Sunday provided the next opportunity for observation. Church services often functioned as extensions of society itself, places where faith and social standing occupied neighboring pews. Families displayed their respectability as carefully as their devotion. Upon arriving with my parents, I noticed numerous familiar faces arranged throughout the congregation. Among them stood Mr. Pembroke. The encounter lasted only moments and consisted merely of a polite exchange before the service commenced. Nevertheless, I observed details previously unnoticed. He appeared thoughtful rather than ambitious, attentive rather than eager to impress. Such qualities were uncommon enough to attract attention. Afterward, while parishioners gathered outside beneath a pale autumn sky, conversation unfolded among various families. Discussions concerned charitable projects, political developments, trade, and marriages either recently completed or anticipated in the near future. Victorian society possessed an extraordinary ability to transform private lives into public subjects. During one such conversation, I overheard two ladies discussing a young woman who had rejected a highly advantageous marriage proposal. Their voices carried unmistakable disapproval. The woman in question was described as foolish, ungrateful, and reckless. No consideration was given to her personal wishes. The assumption remained that security should outweigh affection, and duty should triumph over desire. Their judgment lingered in my thoughts long after the conversation ended. That evening, as darkness settled over London and rain once again tapped softly against my window, I opened my diary with a growing sense that these pages had become my only refuge from the expectations surrounding me. Society appeared determined to convince women that happiness could be measured through status, wealth, and approval. Yet the more closely I observed those around me, the more uncertain that conclusion became. Behind elegant smiles, I detected disappointment. Behind prosperous marriages, I sensed loneliness. Behind flawless reputations, I discovered fear. As I finished writing, a realization emerged with unexpected clarity. The greatest secret in Victorian England was not scandal or impropriety. It was the simple fact that countless people were living lives they had never truly chosen. Several weeks passed before I encountered Mr. Nathaniel Pembroke again. Yet his absence proved almost as influential as his presence. Victorian society possessed an extraordinary talent for creating anticipation. Lives unfolded according to a complicated choreography of invitations, visits, dinners, church gatherings, and social obligations, each event offering only the briefest opportunity for genuine conversation before convention intervened once more. During this period, I devoted increasing attention to the people around me, observing them with a curiosity sharpened by the habit of recording my thoughts each evening. The diary had become more than a secret pastime. It had transformed into a lens through which I examined the world. Once I began looking carefully, I discovered contradictions everywhere. Men spoke proudly of progress while expecting women to remain unchanged. Families celebrated morality while concealing scandals beneath layers of silence. Respectability was admired above all else, yet the effort required to maintain it often appeared exhausting. One afternoon, my mother informed me that we had received an invitation to a small literary gathering hosted by a wealthy widow, known for attracting scholars, artists, and intellectuals to her residence. Such events were considered fashionable because they allowed guests to appear cultivated while remaining safely within the boundaries of acceptable society. Upon arriving, I found the atmosphere remarkably different from the crowded drawing rooms I had come to expect. Conversations focused upon books, discoveries, and ideas rather than family fortunes or marriage prospects. For the first time in many months, I felt genuinely engaged. It was there, among shelves filled with volumes from across Europe, that I once again encountered Mr. Pembroke. He greeted me with the same quiet sincerity I remembered, and soon our conversation resumed with surprising ease. We discussed recent novels, scientific innovations, and the rapid transformation of London itself. The city was changing before our eyes. Railways expanded, factories multiplied, and inventions appeared with astonishing frequency. Yet beneath all this progress, many ancient prejudices remained firmly intact. At one point, our discussion turned toward education. Mr. Pembroke remarked that society wasted an enormous amount of talent by limiting opportunities available to women. The statement startled me. Few gentlemen would have expressed such an opinion openly. For a moment, I wondered whether he fully appreciated how unusual his words sounded. Before I could respond, another guest joined the conversation and the subject shifted elsewhere. Nevertheless, the remark lingered in my thoughts throughout the evening. As guests gradually departed, I found myself standing beside a tall window overlooking the city. Gas lamps illuminated the streets below, while countless chimneys released smoke into the night sky. London appeared vast, restless, and alive. Beside me, Mr. Pembroke observed the same view. He spoke quietly, almost as though addressing the darkness beyond the glass, rather than me directly. He said that every city contained two versions of itself. One existed in public, where people displayed the faces they wished others to see. The other remained hidden behind closed doors, where truth lived without disguise. His words struck me with unexpected force because they echoed the very purpose of my diary. I wondered what hidden truths existed within his own life. Returning home that night, I felt unusually thoughtful. The fire in my bedroom had nearly burned out by the time I opened my notebook. As I wrote, a realization slowly emerged. Perhaps the most important relationships were not formed through grand declarations or dramatic encounters. Perhaps they began with something far rarer. The discovery that another person saw the world through questions similar to your own. As autumn gradually surrendered to the first chill whispers of winter, London seemed to retreat beneath a curtain of fog and coal smoke so dense that entire streets vanished into shadows before evening had fully arrived. The city continued its restless movement beyond our windows, yet within the drawing rooms of respectable society, life followed its customary routines. With almost mechanical precision, invitations arrived, dinners were attended, acquaintances exchanged pleasantries, and discussions of marriages occupied an astonishing amount of conversation. Outwardly, I participated in these rituals as expected. Yet, inwardly, I found my attention increasingly drawn elsewhere. Since our conversation at the literary gathering, Mr. Nathaniel Pembroke had become a more frequent presence within our social circle. We met at dinners, charitable functions, and occasional visits arranged through mutual acquaintances. Nothing improper occurred. Indeed, our interactions remained entirely acceptable by Victorian standards. Yet beneath the surface, I sensed a growing familiarity founded not upon flirtation but upon something rarer. We spoke honestly. Such a statement may seem insignificant, but honesty was not a common commodity within the society I inhabited. One afternoon, an unexpected event disturbed the predictable rhythm of my days. While searching for a volume of poetry in my father's study, I accidentally dislodged a small stack of papers from a cabinet shelf. As I bent to gather them, a folded envelope slipped free and landed at my feet. I had no intention of examining it. Indeed, I immediately reached down to return it. Yet before I could do so, a familiar name caught my attention. The letter was addressed to my father from Lord Ashford, a wealthy and influential gentleman whose family possessed extensive properties throughout the country. I knew the name well because my mother had mentioned it repeatedly during recent months. Curiosity overcame caution. I unfolded the letter only enough to read several lines. What I discovered left me deeply unsettled. The correspondence referred to discussions concerning a possible marriage alliance involving their families. More alarming still, it spoke of arrangements already being considered before any formal courtship had begun. Although my own name appeared nowhere upon the page, the implication was unmistakable. The future of my life was being discussed in private conversations, from which I was entirely absent. A sudden noise in the hallway forced me to return the letter immediately. Moments later, I left the study carrying the poetry book I had originally sought. Yet my thoughts remained fixed upon what I had seen. Throughout dinner that evening, I observed my parents with new eyes. Every remark seemed layered with hidden meanings. Every casual reference to future plans acquired greater significance. Had decisions already been made without my knowledge? Was my future quietly being negotiated? Like a business arrangement between respectable families, the questions followed me upstairs long after the household retired for the night. Seated beside my fire, I opened my diary and attempted to organize my thoughts. As the pen moved across the page, another realization emerged. For months I had believed the greatest challenge facing Victorian women was society's expectation that they remain obedient. Now I began to suspect something even more troubling. Obedience often prevented women from recognizing how little control they truly possessed. Outside, church bells echoed faintly through the fog while distant carriage wheels rattled across wet streets. Somewhere beyond the darkness, thousands of lives unfolded, according to choices freely made. Yet within the elegant houses of respectable London, countless futures were being decided behind closed doors by people convinced they knew what was best for everyone except themselves. And for the first time since beginning this diary, I felt genuine fear about what the coming months might bring. The discovery of the letter altered something fundamental within me. Although outwardly nothing had changed, I could no longer move through the familiar routines of daily life with the same innocence that had once protected me. Every conversation seemed to conceal an unspoken purpose. Every social engagement appeared connected to plans being arranged beyond my knowledge. The certainty that discussions concerning my future were already taking place behind closed doors transformed ordinary events into sources of quiet suspicion. During the following weeks, I observed my parents more carefully than ever before. My mother frequently mentioned Lord Ashcombe's family in conversation, often disguising her interest beneath seemingly casual remarks. My father remained more reserved, yet even his silence appeared meaningful. Together they created the impression of individuals waiting patiently for circumstances to unfold according to a design already established. Christmas approached, bringing with it the elaborate festivities expected of prosperous Victorian households. London glittered beneath winter decorations, while shops displayed extravagant goods intended to celebrate the season. Churches filled with worshippers. Charitable organizations increased their activities, and families gathered to exchange gifts and reaffirm social bonds. Yet, despite the warmth and celebration surrounding me, an undercurrent of unease remained impossible to ignore. One snowy afternoon, an unexpected opportunity presented itself. While visiting a charitable school supported by several prominent families, I encountered Mr. Pembroke among the volunteers, assisting with educational programs for underprivileged children. The sight surprised me. Men of his social standing often participated in charitable activities, yet many treated such responsibilities as obligations rather than genuine interests. Nathaniel, however, appeared entirely absorbed in the work itself. For nearly an hour, I observed him speaking with students, answering questions, and encouraging their ambitions with remarkable patience. The experience revealed a side of his character impossible to discover during formal dinners and drawing room conversations. Later, while walking briefly through the school's courtyard, we found ourselves momentarily separated from the others. Snowflakes drifted slowly from a pale gray sky while the distant sounds of the city echoed beyond the surrounding walls. Our conversation soon turned toward the subject of expectations. Nathaniel remarked that society often confused success with obedience. Many people spent their entire lives fulfilling expectations created by others, and then wondered why happiness remained elusive. His words struck me with unusual force because they mirrored fears I had scarcely admitted even within my diary. For a moment, I considered revealing what I had discovered in my father's study. The temptation was strong, yet caution prevailed. Victorian society granted women few protections once private matters became public. Trust could not be offered carelessly. Before we parted, Nathaniel hesitated as though contemplating whether to say something further. Ultimately, he chose his words with care. He advised me never to allow others to convince me that my opinions mattered less than their ambitions. The statement itself was simple, yet its sincerity lingered long after the conversation ended. That evening, a formal dinner brought together several influential families, including acquaintances of Lord Ashford. Throughout the meal, I endured discussions concerning estates, investments, inheritances, and social connections. Marriage was mentioned repeatedly, though never directly in reference to me. Nevertheless, the implications became increasingly difficult to ignore. I felt less like a participant in the evening, and more like a subject being quietly evaluated. Returning to my room after midnight, I sat beside the dying fire and opened my diary. Outside, fresh snow covered the streets of London, softening the city's harsh edges beneath a blanket of white. For several minutes I simply stared at the page before writing a single observation. Sometimes the most dangerous prisons are not built from stone walls or iron bars. Sometimes they are constructed from expectations so old and familiar that few people even recognize them as prisons at all. The weeks following my refusal transformed the atmosphere within our household in ways both subtle and unmistakable. No open hostility existed, nor were harsh words exchanged. Yet an invisible tension settled over every meal and conversation. My mother became unusually attentive, as though convinced that sufficient persuasion might eventually correct what she regarded as a temporary lapse in judgment. My father withdrew into thoughtful silence, observing developments with the caution of a man uncertain whether patience or intervention would prove more effective. Meanwhile, society continued its relentless march forward. Indifferent to private struggles unfolding behind respectable doors, invitations arrived, carriages rolled through London's crowded streets, and countless young women accepted futures chosen for them. Long before they understood the nature of the choice, February brought frequent rain and thick fog that lingered above the city like a living thing. One evening, after returning from a dinner I had endured rather than enjoyed, I found sleep impossible. Restlessness drove me from my room, and I wandered quietly through the darkened corridors of the house. Most of the servants had retired, and only the occasional flicker of a gas lamp disturbed the shadows. As I passed near my father's study, I noticed a faint light beneath the door. Curious, I paused. Voices drifted through the silence. One belonged to my father. The other I recognized immediately as Lord Ashford. Their conversation was calm but serious. I had no intention of eavesdropping, yet a single phrase rooted me to the spot. Lord Ashcombe remarked that the arrangement must proceed carefully because the matter concerned more than marriage. The words were followed by a discussion I could only partially hear. References were made to financial difficulties, investments, and obligations extending back many years. Although much of the conversation remained unclear, one fact emerged with startling certainty. The proposed union between Edward Ashford and myself was connected to interests far larger than personal happiness or social compatibility. Business considerations were involved. Family fortunes appeared entangled in ways I had never suspected. Before I could hear more, movement within the study forced me to retreat quietly down the corridor. My heart raced as I returned to my room. For several minutes, I sat motionless beside the fire, attempting to understand the implications of what I had overheard. Until that moment, I had assumed my parents genuinely believed they were acting in my best interests, even if their understanding of happiness differed from my own. Now, a disturbing possibility presented itself. What if the proposed marriage served purposes they preferred not to discuss openly? The following afternoon brought an unexpected encounter with Nathaniel Pembroke during a visit to a museum exhibition. We spent nearly an hour examining historical artifacts and discussing recent archaeological discoveries. Throughout our conversation, I found my attention divided. Part of me remained present while another part wrestled with the questions occupying my thoughts. Eventually, Nathaniel noticed my distraction. His concern appeared sincere. For a brief moment, I considered confiding in him. Yet once again, caution prevailed. Victorian society rewarded discretion and punished imprudence. Trust required certainty, and certainty remained elusive. As we prepared to part, however, Nathaniel offered an observation that seemed strangely appropriate. He remarked that truth often reveals itself gradually, because people rarely accept it all at once. The statement lingered with me long after our farewell. That evening, I returned to my diary with a sense of urgency unlike anything I had previously experienced. The mystery surrounding Lord Ashcombe's interest no longer seemed speculative. Something important was being concealed. Whether the secret involved finances, reputation, or obligations inherited from an earlier generation, I could not yet determine. Yet one conclusion appeared increasingly unavoidable. My future was being shaped by forces extending far beyond affection, and somewhere within the shadows of respectable Victorian society lay a truth that certain people hoped would never be discovered. The weeks following my refusal transformed the atmosphere within our household in ways both subtle and unmistakable. No open hostility existed, nor were harsh words exchanged. Yet an invisible tension settled over every meal and conversation. My mother became unusually attentive, as though convinced that sufficient persuasion might eventually correct what she regarded as a temporary lapse in judgment. My father withdrew into thoughtful silence, observing developments with the caution of a man uncertain whether patience or intervention would prove more effective. Meanwhile, society continued its relentless march forward. Indifferent to private struggles unfolding behind respectable doors, invitations arrived, carriages rolled through London's crowded streets, and countless young women accepted futures chosen for them, long before they understood the nature of the choice. February brought frequent rain and thick fog that lingered above the city like a living thing. One evening, after returning from a dinner I had endured rather than enjoyed, I found sleep impossible. Restlessness drove me from my room, and I wandered quietly through the darkened corridors of the house. Most of the servants had retired, and only the occasional flicker of a gas lamp disturbed the shadows. As I passed near my father's study, I noticed a faint light beneath the door. Curious, I paused. Voices drifted through the silence. One belonged to my father. The other I recognized immediately as Lord Ashcombe. Their conversation was calm but serious. I had no intention of eavesdropping, yet a single phrase rooted me to the spot. Lord Ashcombe remarked that the arrangement must proceed carefully, because the matter concerned more than marriage. The words were followed by a discussion I could only partially hear. References were made to financial difficulties, investments, and obligations extending back many years. Although much of the conversation remained unclear, one fact emerged with startling certainty. The proposed union between Edward Ashford and myself was connected to interests far larger than personal happiness or social compatibility. Business considerations were involved. Family fortunes appeared entangled in ways I had never suspected. Before I could hear more, movement within the study forced me to retreat quietly down the corridor. My heart raced as I returned to my room. For several minutes, I sat motionless beside the fire, attempting to understand the implications of what I had overheard. Until that moment, I had assumed my parents genuinely believed they were acting in my best interests, even if their understanding of happiness differed from my own. Now, a disturbing possibility presented itself. What if the proposed marriage served purposes they preferred not to discuss openly? The following afternoon brought an unexpected encounter with Nathaniel Pembroke during a visit to a museum exhibition. We spent nearly an hour examining historical artifacts and discussing recent archaeological discoveries. Throughout our conversation, I found my attention divided. Part of me remained present while another part wrestled with the questions occupying my thoughts. Eventually, Nathaniel noticed my distraction. His concern appeared sincere. For a brief moment, I considered confiding in him. Yet, once again, caution prevailed. Victorian society rewarded discretion and punished imprudence. Trust required certainty, and certainty remained elusive. As we prepared to part, however, Nathaniel offered an observation that seemed strangely appropriate. He remarked that truth often reveals itself gradually, because people rarely accept it all at once. The statement lingered with me long after our farewell. That evening, I returned to my diary with a sense of urgency unlike anything I had previously experienced. The mystery surrounding Lord Ashcombe's interest no longer seemed speculative. Something important was being concealed. Whether the secret involved finances, reputation, or obligations inherited from an earlier generation, I could not yet determine. Yet one conclusion appeared increasingly unavoidable. My future was being shaped by forces extending far beyond affection, and somewhere within the shadows of respectable Victorian society lay a truth that certain people hoped would never be discovered. March arrived with uncertain weather and a city suspended between winter and spring. The fogs that had dominated London for months began to lift, revealing streets crowded with merchants, laborers, carriages, and dreamers pursuing their separate destinies beneath the same gray sky. Yet despite the changing season, the mystery surrounding my future seemed only to deepen. The conversation I had overheard between my father and Lord Ashford refused to leave my thoughts. Their words had revealed too little to provide answers, and too much to permit peace of mind. I became increasingly determined to understand what connection existed between their financial concerns and the proposed marriage. Such investigations were hardly suitable occupations for a Victorian lady, which perhaps explains why I found them so compelling. Society expected women to accept information rather than seek it. I was beginning to question that expectation. One afternoon, fortune provided an unexpected opportunity. My father received a visitor and left his study in haste to attend another engagement. Before the gentleman arrived, a servant informed me that he would return shortly. As chance would have it, I happened to be passing through the hallway when I noticed several documents lying unattended upon the desk. Through the partially open door, I hesitated. Everything I had been taught insisted that entering would be improper. Yet another voice within me argued that decisions affecting my entire future were being made without my consent. Before caution could overcome curiosity, I stepped inside. The room was silent except for the ticking of a clock. Several papers appeared entirely ordinary. Correspondence, account ledgers, and business records covered the desk. Then I discovered a leather folder marked with the names Ashford and Ashcombe. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. What I found transformed suspicion into certainty. Nearly 15 years earlier, my father had invested a substantial portion of the family's fortune in a commercial venture. undertaken jointly with Lord Ashford. The enterprise had initially prospered, but later suffered severe losses. Additional investments, intended to recover those losses, only deepened the problem. Over time, a complicated network of debts, obligations, and agreements emerged between the two families. According to the documents before me, a marriage between Edward Ashcombe and myself would effectively unite certain properties and financial interests, resolving difficulties that neither family wished to expose publicly. I stared at the pages in disbelief. The realization was devastating, not because it revealed cruelty, but because it revealed calculation. My future had become part of a solution, not a daughter, not an individual. A solution. The sound of approaching footsteps forced me to close the folder and leave immediately. Moments later, I was back in the corridor, my pulse racing. Yet the truth remained with me. Everything suddenly made sense. The persistence of Lord Ashcombe's interest, my mother's enthusiasm, the careful pressure applied over recent months. The marriage represented far more than a social alliance. It was a financial strategy disguised as a romantic possibility. That evening, I attended a concert with my parents and several acquaintances. Music filled the grand hall, while London's most respectable families occupied their assigned seats. Around me, conversations flowed effortlessly. Yet, for the first time, I felt separated from the world I had always known. Its customs no longer appeared noble. Its traditions no longer seemed unquestionable. Behind elegance, I now saw negotiation. Behind courtesy, I recognized self-interest. After the performance concluded, I unexpectedly encountered Nathaniel Pembroke among the departing guests. He immediately noticed my troubled expression. This time I came closer than ever before to sharing the truth. Though I still withheld details, I admitted that I had recently discovered certain realities about my future that left me deeply unsettled. Nathaniel listened carefully before offering a response I would remember for the rest of my life. He said that every person eventually reaches a moment when they must choose between the life others have prepared for them and the life they believe belongs to them. The courage required for that choice often determines everything that follows. That night, as I recorded his words in my diary, I understood that such a moment was approaching far more quickly than I had imagined. The arrival of April brought longer days and the first signs of spring to London. Yet the renewal visible in parks and gardens seemed strangely absent from the drawing rooms of respectable society. Their old ambitions continued to flourish with remarkable vigor. Since discovering the true purpose behind the proposed marriage, I found it increasingly difficult to participate in conversations that treated my future as a matter already settled. Every mention of Edward Ashcombe, every approving glance exchanged between families, every carefully arranged social encounter deepened my determination to resist becoming part of an agreement I had never chosen, yet determination alone could not provide a solution. Victorian society offered women few paths toward independence, especially those born into families where reputation carried immense importance. The problem was not simply refusing one future. It was discovering another. During these weeks, my diary became both companion and confidant. Each evening I recorded observations, questions, and fears that could be shared nowhere else. Looking back through earlier entries, I noticed a change in my own writing. The timid uncertainty that had characterized my first pages had gradually disappeared. In its place emerged something stronger. Not confidence exactly, but clarity. I was beginning to understand what I believed, even if I had not yet decided what actions those beliefs required. One afternoon, an unexpected letter arrived. The handwriting belonged to Nathaniel Pembroke. Such correspondence was entirely proper because its contents concerned a public lecture on history and science to be held later that week. Nevertheless, receiving the note produced a curious feeling I struggled to define. The invitation itself was extended to several acquaintances, yet I suspected the gesture carried a more personal significance. When the evening arrived, I attended with my parents and joined a crowd gathered within a grand lecture hall illuminated by hundreds of lamps. The speaker discussed the extraordinary transformations reshaping the modern world. Railways connected distant regions. New inventions altered daily life. Education expanded. Scientific discoveries challenged assumptions that had remained unquestioned for generations. Listening to the lecture, I could not help noticing an irony that seemed invisible to many around me. Society eagerly embraced technological progress while fiercely resisting social change. Machines evolved more rapidly than attitudes. After the event concluded, guests lingered in conversation. It was during one such discussion that Nathaniel introduced me to a woman named Miss Clara Hargreaves. Unlike most ladies I encountered, Clara lived independently and supported herself through writing and journalism. Her opinions were intelligent, direct, and refreshingly unconcerned with convention. During our conversation, she described traveling alone, publishing articles under her own name, and pursuing work she genuinely valued. To many within respectable society, such choices would have appeared unconventional, perhaps even alarming. To me, they appeared extraordinary. For the first time, I met a woman whose life had not been entirely designed by others. That evening left a profound impression upon me. Returning home through streets glistening beneath recent rain, I found myself imagining possibilities that had previously seemed impossible. If Clara Hargreaves could build a life guided by her own decisions, perhaps other women might do the same. Perhaps the limits society described as permanent were not permanent at all. Several days later, my parents informed me that Lord Ashcombe intended to visit our home once again to discuss future arrangements. The announcement no longer inspired fear. Instead, I experienced a surprising sense of calm. The truth had altered something fundamental within me. I now understood what was at stake and why. Certain people were so determined to influence my choices. As I sat beside my window that night, watching moonlight illuminate the rooftops of London, a realization settled over me with unusual certainty. Courage rarely arrives as a sudden burst of heroism. More often it grows quietly through a series of small decisions until one day a person discovers they are no longer willing to surrender what they know to be right. And I sensed that such a day was drawing near. Lord Ashcombe's visit took place on a bright afternoon in late April, when sunlight streamed through the tall windows of our drawing room and illuminated every polished surface with deceptive warmth. To an outside observer, the gathering would have appeared entirely pleasant. Tea was served, conversation flowed politely, and the rituals of respectable society unfolded exactly as expected. Yet beneath the elegance lingered a tension invisible to everyone, except those whose futures were being negotiated. Edward Ashcombe accompanied his father and conducted himself with perfect courtesy throughout the visit. He spoke confidently about upcoming travels, improvements planned for family properties, and various matters of public interest. Listening to him, I found myself wondering whether he understood the full nature of the arrangement being constructed around us. Was he an active participant in these plans, or merely another individual following expectations established by previous generations? The question remained unanswered. What became increasingly clear, however, was that events were accelerating. Before the afternoon concluded, Lord Ashcombe requested a private discussion with my parents. Although I was not invited to participate, the purpose of the conversation required little imagination. For nearly an hour they remained behind closed doors while I sat beside a window overlooking the street below. Carriages passed. Pedestrians hurried along the pavement. Life continued beyond our house with complete indifference to the decisions being made inside it. For the first time, I seriously considered what might happen if I refused absolutely. Not delayed, not negotiated, refused. The possibility felt both terrifying and strangely liberating. When the meeting finally ended, I needed only a single glance at my mother's expression to understand the outcome. That evening, she informed me that an official courtship was expected to begin soon. The announcement was presented as though it were a natural progression of events. Rather than a proposal requiring my approval, something within me shifted. For months, I had listened, observed, questioned, and hesitated. Now hesitation seemed impossible. The following day, I sought an opportunity to think away from the influence of family and society. Under the pretense of visiting a bookshop, I traveled alone to a quieter district of London where public gardens overlooked the river. There I walked among blooming trees and newly opened flowers while reflecting upon everything that had occurred. The city around me represented a world in transition. Industry expanded. New ideas spread through newspapers and lecture halls. Opportunities unavailable to previous generations gradually emerged. Yet within the private sphere of family life, many ancient assumptions remained untouched. Women were still expected to sacrifice personal desires for social advantage. The contradiction no longer seemed acceptable. During my walk, I unexpectedly encountered Clara Hargreaves. She greeted me warmly and soon sensed the seriousness of my mood. Unlike most people in my life, Clara possessed little interest in preserving comforting illusions. After listening carefully to a limited version of my situation, she offered advice remarkable for its simplicity. She said that every important choice eventually carries a cost. The real question is not whether a price must be paid, but whether the thing being protected is worth that price. Her words remained with me throughout the journey home. That night, after the household had fallen asleep, I opened my diary and reviewed the entries that had accumulated over the previous months. Page after page documented my gradual awakening to realities I had once accepted without question. The young woman who had begun this journal in October seemed almost like a stranger. She had hoped truth alone would provide answers. Now I understood that truth was only the beginning. Action must follow. As midnight approached, I wrote a sentence unlike any that had appeared in these pages before. Whatever consequences await me, I will choose my own future. And for the first time since this story began, I meant those words without reservation. May arrived in a burst of color that transformed London's parks and gardens into landscapes of extraordinary beauty. Trees stood clothed in fresh green leaves. Flower beds exploded with vibrant blossoms, and sunlight lingered longer each evening upon the city's rooftops. Yet, while the world around me seemed determined to celebrate renewal, my own life approached a confrontation that could alter everything. During the weeks following my decision, I had experienced an unfamiliar sense of calm. The uncertainty that once haunted me had gradually disappeared. In its place remained a clear understanding of what I could and could not accept. The future proposed by my parents and Lord Ashcombe no longer appeared inevitable. It was merely one possibility among many. The challenge now lay in convincing others of that fact. The opportunity arrived sooner than expected. One evening my father requested that I join him in his study after dinner. The formality of the invitation immediately signaled the seriousness of the conversation to come. As I entered the familiar room, I noticed my mother already seated near the fireplace. Their expressions revealed a mixture of concern and determination. The moment had arrived. My father began by speaking kindly. He reminded me of the advantages offered by the Ashcombe family and emphasized the security such a marriage would provide. My mother described the opportunities, status, and comfort awaiting me. Together they presented their arguments with genuine conviction. Neither believed they were acting selfishly. They were products of their generation, shaped by values they had inherited and rarely questioned. Listening to them, I felt no anger, only sadness. When they finally finished, I spoke more honestly than ever before. I explained that I understood their intentions and appreciated their concern. Yet I could not marry a man simply because such a union benefited to families. Marriage, if it was to occur at all, required respect, understanding, and personal choice. Without those things, even the grandest arrangement would eventually become a prison. The silence that followed seemed endless. My mother's disappointment was immediate and visible. My father remained motionless, studying me with an expression I could not fully interpret. For a long moment no one spoke. Then, quietly, he asked whether another person influenced my decision. The question caught me by surprise. I considered Nathaniel Pembroke and the role he had played in my awakening. Yet the truth was more complicated. This decision had not been made because of him. It had been made because of me. I answered accordingly. My father listened carefully. To my astonishment, something in his expression softened. Perhaps for the first time he recognized that the daughter standing before him was no longer a child. The conversation continued for nearly an hour. No dramatic resolution occurred. No immediate agreement was reached. Yet, when it ended, I sensed that an important barrier had been crossed. For the first time, my parents had heard not obedience, not hesitation, but conviction. Several days later, I received an unexpected note from Nathaniel. He requested permission to call upon our family during an upcoming afternoon. The message itself remained entirely proper. Yet I could not ignore the significance of its timing. Whether by coincidence or design, events seemed to be moving toward a conclusion neither of us could fully predict. That night, I sat beside my open window as a gentle spring breeze carried distant sounds from the city below. London stretched endlessly into the darkness, filled with millions of lives and countless untold stories. Somewhere among them, people were making choices that would shape their futures forever. Closing my diary for the evening, I realized that courage had already changed me. Even if every plan failed, even if every expectation collapsed, I could never return to the person I had been before. The greatest transformation had already occurred. I had learned that my life belonged to me. The weeks that followed seemed suspended between two worlds. One belonged to the future others had imagined for me, a future of carefully arranged expectations, advantageous alliances, and quiet obedience. The other remained uncertain and uncharted, offering no guarantees beyond the promise that the choices within it would be my own. As spring deepened and London flourished beneath longer days and warmer evenings, I found myself standing at the threshold between those competing destinies. The anticipated visit from Nathaniel Pembroke took place on a mild afternoon in early June. My parents received him courteously, though I sensed they regarded his presence with increasing curiosity. Until recently, he had been simply another acquaintance within our social circle. Now, however, circumstances had changed. The question of my future had transformed every interaction into a matter of greater significance. Our conversation remained entirely proper, yet beneath the discussion of books, public affairs, and recent events flowed an understanding that neither of us openly acknowledged. For months we had spoken as friends, yet friendship had gradually evolved into something more substantial, built not upon romantic fantasy, but upon mutual respect and shared convictions. Several days later, events took an unexpected turn. My father requested another private conversation. This time, only the two of us met within his study. The atmosphere felt markedly different from previous discussions. The frustration and disappointment that had once defined our conversations seemed absent. In their place remained a quiet seriousness. To my surprise, my father revealed information he had never previously shared. The financial difficulties connecting our family to the Ashcombs were considerably more severe than I had imagined. Years earlier, a series of unfortunate investments had threatened substantial losses. Lord Ashcombe had assisted in preventing disaster, creating obligations that lingered long after the immediate crisis had passed. The proposed marriage had emerged gradually as a solution benefiting both families. As he spoke, I realized something important. My father was not attempting to manipulate me. He was finally telling the truth. For the first time, he described his fears, mistakes, and responsibilities openly. When he finished, silence filled the room. Then I answered with equal honesty. I explained that I understood the burden he carried and respected the sacrifices he had made for our family. To my astonishment, he did not argue. As I sat upon a bench overlooking the river, I reflected upon the strange journey that had begun with a secret diary and a desire to tell the truth. I had started as a young woman observing the world. Somewhere along the way, I had become someone willing to challenge it. Returning home, I opened my diary and wrote a final thought before closing the book for the night. Freedom does not arrive when obstacles disappear. Freedom arrives when fear no longer decides your choices. And for the first time in my life, I felt truly free. The summer of 1873 arrived with remarkable warmth, and for the first time in many months, I greeted the changing season without fear of what the future might contain. The storm that had overshadowed my life for nearly a year had finally passed, not because every difficulty had vanished, nor because every question had been answered, but because the most important battle had already been won. I had claimed ownership of my own future. In the weeks following Lord Ashcombe's departure, life within our household slowly settled into a new and unfamiliar balance. My mother required time to accept the collapse of plans she had long believed essential to my happiness. Yet even she gradually began to understand that a peaceful life built upon unwilling sacrifice could never bring genuine contentment. My father changed most of all. The honesty that had emerged during our conversations remained. For the first time, I saw him not simply as a parent but as a man who had spent decades carrying burdens, responsibilities, and regrets invisible to those around him. Understanding replaced much of the distance that had once separated us. As for Edward Ashcombe, our paths crossed only once more during a public gathering later that summer. He greeted me courteously and displayed no resentment regarding the outcome. Indeed, I sensed he may have felt relief himself. Perhaps he too had been following expectations rather than desires. We parted as acquaintances, whose lives had briefly intersected before, continuing in different directions. Meanwhile, my friendship with Nathaniel Pembroke continued to deepen. Free from the shadow of arrangements and obligations, we came to know one another with greater honesty than ever before. Our conversations expanded beyond books and public affairs to include hopes, fears, ambitions, and beliefs. What emerged was not the dramatic romance celebrated in popular novels, but something far more enduring: mutual respect, trust, understanding, the qualities capable of sustaining a lifetime. By autumn, Nathaniel formally requested my father's permission to court me. This time, no negotiations occurred behind closed doors. No financial calculations influenced the decision. No expectations were imposed. The choice belonged entirely to us. When my father gave his blessing, I experienced a quiet happiness unlike anything I had previously known. It was not excitement. It was certainty. Several months later, on a cool evening remarkably similar to the one upon which this diary had begun, I found myself once again seated beside a fire, with these pages open before me. Outside, rain tapped gently against the windows. The familiar sound carried me back to that October night when I had written a simple promise: I intend to tell the truth. Looking back through the diary, I scarcely recognized the young woman who had first placed pen to paper. She had been obedient, uncertain, and frightened of disappointing others. She believed the world was fixed, and that her role within it had already been decided. Yet the pages before me told a different story. They recorded not merely the events of a year, but the transformation of a life. I had learned that truth possesses extraordinary power. Not because it makes life easier, but because it makes freedom possible. Many women of my generation would never receive opportunities I had been fortunate enough to find. Many would continue living within boundaries they had no power to escape. Yet I hoped that change was coming. The world was evolving. Slowly, imperfectly, and often reluctantly, but evolving nonetheless. Perhaps one day young women would inherit choices that previous generations could scarcely imagine. As the fire burned low and midnight approached, I wrote the final words that would ever appear within this diary. If these pages survive after I am gone, let them stand as evidence that even within the strictest corners of Victorian society, there were women who questioned, who dreamed, and who chose courage over obedience. The world may remember great politicians, inventors, and kings, but history is also shaped by ordinary people who quietly refuse to surrender themselves. I began this diary in secret. I ended in freedom, and that, I believe, is the happiest ending any story can possess.